All right. So this is the fifth in a series of interviews I'm conducting to try to better understand why food prices have been rising, where they're going, and what we can do about it. And I have here with me Alan Williams, who is going to join me to talk about conventional, organic, and regenerative agriculture and how fuel and fertilizer inputs differ between them and how regenerative agriculture can offer us resilience in the face of what looks like possibly an emerging food crisis. And Alan, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Thank you very much.
Before we jump into the details, could you tell us a little bit about what you do in your work as a farmer and as a consultant and an educator, and the perspective that you're coming from?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I'm actually a lifelong farmer, born and raised on my family's farm in South Carolina, and ended up spending about 15 years in academia at one portion of my life as a researcher and a professor. And then in the year 2000, I went back into farming full time, as well as consulting with other farmers and ranchers, food companies, and so forth. So, what we do now is my partners and I formed a company called Understanding Ag, and we work with farmers and ranchers, processors, food companies, and many others, across the spectrum, both in the U.S. and about 34 other countries. So we have worked globally in what we're doing in the U.S. alone right now. We're working across about 32 million acres that are under regenerative transition. So this is growing rapidly, and in the interest globally is growing rapidly. And we also have the Soil Health Academy, which is our educational arm. We use that to teach and train farmers, ranchers, and many others in how to practically implement regenerative agriculture. And more recently, we formed a regenerative verification company called Regenified to specifically address the need for food companies and consumers to be able to have the assurance that they're getting foods that were regeneratively produced.
Yeah, that's fantastic because one of my questions would have been, how on earth are we going to know whether what we're buying actually fits this criteria? All right, so before we kind of move on from things, let's get to the basics and just kind of give some definitions here. So, how would you see the proper distinctions between conventional, organic, and regenerative, and if if there are any other distinctions that you feel are appropriate, if you could kind of give us, how you would define those?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. So actually, I've actively participated at some point in my life in all three. So I have firsthand intimate knowledge of that. Conventional agriculture is, as most people anticipate, it relies very heavily on synthetic and chemical inputs. It's pretty fossil fuel intensive. And, that's what the majority of agriculture, both in the US and in the world, is. It's what we would describe as conventional agriculture. There is, tillage of the soil on an annual basis, usually multiple times a year. There is a quite heavy reliance on the utilization of synthetic fertilizers to be able to apply fertility to those soils and to feed the plants and to get the yields that they're desiring. And there's also a pretty heavy reliance on all sorts of pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. And I'll just interject here real briefly that in terms of the use of all of these different pesticides and synthetic fertilizers, that usage rate has increased over the last several decades, not decreased. So we're becoming more and more reliant on them within conventional agriculture. So that's the basics of it. Also conventional agriculture makes heavy use of genetically modified crops. So that's pretty common. What we would call a GM crop, modified for different traits. When we're talking about certified organic production, the real crux of certified organic production is that it hinges on whether or not you use disallowed inputs. And those disallowed inputs would be synthetic fertilizers. You are allowed to use practically any animal manure that may exist: broiler litter, laying hen manure, feedlot manure, dairy effluent, hog effluent. All of those things are allowed. But what is not allowed is the use of synthetic fertilizers and the pesticides that we typically see. However, that being said, there are organic pesticides that are used in organic production. And they have to be, what is known as OMRI listed, the materials list for organic materials. So anything that's used within organic has to be OMRI approved before an organic farmer can use it. But what is not there, there's no restrictions on the amount of times that you can till your soil on an annual basis. And as a matter of fact, since most organic farmers do not use chemical herbicides to control weeds like a conventional farmer does, their primary method of control is tillage. So many organic farmers actually till the soil more times annually than a conventional farmer does. And it can be as much as twice annually what a conventional farmer may do in terms of tillage of the soil. Now, when we talk about regenerative, what we are talking about, and we define it this way with an understanding ag. We define regenerative as farming and ranching in synchrony with nature and the 4 ecosystem processes to repair, restore, rebuild, and revitalize life, starting with life beneath the soil and expanding to life above. So the big difference, Chris, between both conventional and organic agriculture, both of those are highly input intensive, okay? Both of them. Regenerative is not. Regenerative is all about reducing our reliance on external applied inputs and on mechanical action. So that's one of the key differences. And what we find here is that when we practice regenerative versus organic and conventional, we are creating far healthier soils, and we are creating more diverse and vibrant ecosystems.
Great. Could you give a few examples of OMRI listed chemicals that organics get or that are used in organic farming? Like what are some of the common ones?
Yeah, so there are organic fat-based organic herbicides, that certified organic farmers will use to help control weeds now. So that will be one example. An OMRI listed herbicide that is used to help control weeds.
And so is the OMRI list, is that just for herbicides, or is that for fertilizers and pesticides and all the other things like that as well?
So with fertilizers, pretty much any animal fertilizer can be used in a certified organic operation. So I could go down the road to a conventional broiler operation, so one of the vertical integrators operations, and I could bring that broiler litter back and apply it to a certified organic operation and not be in violation. So you do not have to use certified organic or OMRI listed manures. I can use practically any animal manure that I can get my hands on if I wanted to in a certified organic.
Got it. And so it would seem that in the organic case, while you might not be directly relying on the global trade of fertilizer inputs as applied directly to the soil, you are ineffectively participating in it possibly just as much, in the sense that somewhere down the line, someone is using internationally traded internationally traded fertilizers that go into the soil to grow food that gets fed to an animal that becomes manure that winds up on the organic farm. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's the case. Again, I mean, if we're just very honest in what we're talking about here, so if we take the instance of the commercial broiler litter that organic farmers can go buy and apply, then those chickens would have been fed a genetically modified crop ration that was produced very conventionally. So that crop itself that the chickens were fed, yes, that crop was raised using synthetic fertilizers and herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. And so that's what the chickens ate. That produced the manure that the organic farmer is then using. Many times those chickens are also given feed grade antibiotics or subtherapeutic antibiotics because they're in those massive houses and in confined conditions. So a lot of times they're given subtherapeutic antibiotics. So you also have antibiotic residue in these manures as well, and you can also have the presence of heavy metals in these manures. So all of those are allowed under current NOP regulations to be able to use on organic farms.
Yeah, this is somewhat of a tangent, but you've been at this for a while. Is it your impression that the USDA organic labeling has made this worse? Because my impression was there used to be regional farming associations that had stricter organic standards, and then when USDA took it over, they were supplanted, and it sort of lowered the bar on a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, that will be correct. For organic farmers that have been in this for decades, for a long time, the original standards and intent of those standards was a lot better than actuality today. So no doubt, the standards have been watered down, dumbed down, however you want to say it, and things allowed that originally the intent was not to go there.
Yeah. All right, so let's move into regenerative farming a little bit. So I understand the big picture of what it's trying to accomplish, and the lack of reliance on some of these other things that are going on in other types of farming. But can you give some kind of what would a typical regenerative farm look like, and how if it's not getting manure inputs or chemical fertilizer inputs or any of these other things, how is it accomplishing the health of the soil and so on? What does that model look like?
Yeah. So first of all, let's be very clear in terms of regenerative. Everything is still in the toolbox. It's just how do we use everything more judiciously and reduce our reliance on them. So regenerative farms can start down this path still using any of the tools that are available to conventional or organic farmers. But the goal with regenerative is not to continue to have that reliance on whether it's a synthetic, whether it's a chemical, whether it's a purchased and applied manure, things like that, or even a lot of tillage. The goal is to reduce all of those things over time so that you are more resilient. Again, you're building your soils, you're building resilience, and you're building nutrient density into the foods that you're producing. So what typically happens is this. We start with looking at what can we do on a farm to be able to begin that process of reduced reliance on any of these practices that can be harmful and detrimental. So, for instance, in a conventional row crop operation, and even in organic row crop operations, many have not been using cover crops. So that's an obvious place to start. In between the monoculture cash crops, we plant a much more diverse cover crop mix. That cover crop then starts to repair and rebuild the soil. It starts to build that very important mycorrhizal fungi population in the soil and the other broader microbial population, aggregating the soil, improving water infiltration and retention capacity, which all of our soils desperately need now. And it also produces fertility for the next cash crop, that next monoculture crop that may go in the ground. And so again, both the vast majority of both our conventional farmers and our organic farmers are desperately needing to incorporate more cover crop usage on their farms and more diverse cover crop mixes. I've planted a monoculture, corn, soybeans, wheat, whatever. I don't want to follow that with a monoculture cover crop. Now I'm just monoculture after monoculture, right? I have no diversity. So the whole point of a cover crop is not just to cover the ground in between the cash crops, but it's to build soil, feed the soil, and feed the next crop, and also to build ecosystems. So it takes diversity in those cover crops to do that. So the next thing that we like to do is incorporate livestock through what we call adaptive grazing. So the cover crop provides some of the nutrients and fertility to feed the next cash crop. But then when we layer livestock grazed adaptively on those cover crops over top of that, now the livestock are applying manure straight out of their rear ends, right? As they're moving across those cover crop pastures, grazing those. So that manure and urine directly out of their rear end then becomes the fertility for the next cash crop. Now, I want to make one clarifying point here, though. The manure that drops straight out of the rear end of an animal grazing a diverse mix of plants is entirely different than manures coming from a CAFO operation fed, a TMR or total mixed ration produced conventionally. There's no similarity here. They're not the same product. They don't contain the same microbes. So the natural manures coming straight out of animals actively grazing in fields is the manure that has been used by nature for millennia to fertilize, to build the tremendous fertility that we once had. But these purchased and applied manures are not the same. And we cannot equate them to the value of the manure coming straight out of the rear end of an animal.
So one thing that pops into my mind here as I'm listening to this is if I'm thinking about the fertilizer inputs that would be in a conventional operation, my understanding is they would be focusing on NPK, so nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And so we're looking at, in terms of the inputs that are increasing in price right now, we're looking at ammonia and we're looking at phosphate and we're looking at potash for potassium, if I understand that right. And so what I'm hearing from you, like the first thing that pops into my mind is that nitrogen is in the air and you shouldn't need to necessarily have a complicated industrial process for it. And what I assume is happening here is as you improve the microbial populations in the soil, you have more nitrogen fixing, and then you have further processing of that nitrogen through the animal that's re-layering it down in other forms. And so you're basically completely cutting out the need for like an ammonia input. Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah. So first of all, every day of every year over every acre on the earth, there is more than 30,000 tons of nitrogen above every acre every day. Of course, it's in the N2 form, right? Atmospheric nitrogen. And N2 nitrogen is not readily available for plant uptake. So the plants can't use that form, but it's there. more than 30,000 tons of free nitrogen, setting above every acre every year. So as my partner and close friend Gabe Brown says, why in the heck are we writing checks for nitrogen, right?
Right.
So what we have to do is establish the microbial population in the soil beneath it to be able to capture that nitrogen and convert it into a form that plants can then use. This is what we can't forget here. And oftentimes it seems like we have. In just 80 years, we have forgotten that nature provided all the nitrogen that every plant in the world needed for eons.
Yeah.
And we grew more biomass globally then than we can grow now. Okay, that's what we also need to remember. Without us making nitrogen and applying synthetic nitrogen, this earth once produced a lot more plant biomass on its own from that free nitrogen that's in the atmosphere every day. And of course, we're breathing in, with every breath we take, 78% nitrogen. So our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen. So what happens here is there are rhizobial bacteria, and there's many species of those that form an association with legume plants in the soil to capture atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into a nitrogen that plants can then take up. But there are also what we call free living nitrogen fixing bacteria, like azotobacter and things like that, that even without an association with a legume plant like clover or alfalfa or soybeans or whatever, these azotobacter and other free living nitrogen fixing bacteria can take in nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it into a form that plants can use. So all we're doing in regenerative agriculture, Chris, is just simply creating the pathway for this very natural process to once again occur in an efficient and effective manner.
What do you think accounts for the apparent decline in the biomass yield? Does that relate to the inferiority of the type of nitrogen that we're applying, or is it just that the limiting factors are elsewhere and we're putting too much emphasis on NPK inputs?
Yeah, well, nothing is ever singular. We have a rule that we call the rule of compounding. And that simply means that there never are any singular effects. Everything that occurs out here in nature and biology creates compounding, cascading effects, and they're never neutral. They're either positive or negative. Okay. So if we look at what nature does, nature always creates a series of very positive compounding, cascading effects. So when we think about more than 30,000 tons of nitrogen above every acre, and nature having this incredible array of microbes underneath the soil surface with the ability to be able to capture and convert that nitrogen into a form that plants can use on a just-in-time basis all the time, right? So it's an incredibly efficient, effective process. In other words, nature does this a whole lot better than we do. But what do? Okay, when we apply nitrogen, first of all, we're going out and we're buying some form of synthetic nitrogen. And whenever we buy and apply synthetic nitrogen, for every 1 pound of synthetic nitrogen that we put on, farmers are very lucky if 50 to 60% of that is actually taken up by a plant. You lose it, and you lose a lot of it very rapidly through denitrification, through leaching and runoff, through volatilization, and other ways. So it's an incredibly inefficient process that we're trying to do. So we're buying, every farmer is buying every pound. But at best, they're getting a half pound utilization. So that's like you going out and buying a car and you cut the car in half and give half back, and you get to only keep one half of your car after you've paid for the whole car. That's what we're doing as farmers. So that right there creates inefficiencies. The other thing that creates inefficiencies in the use of nitrogen is that synthetic nitrogen is applied, sucked up by the plants, and then you're done. You're done. You got to buy and apply again, buy and apply again, right? It's not that way with nitrogen from the atmosphere. It's always there, and it's always just in time. So we're trying to feed plants this big dose of nitrogen all at once, whereas nature is feeding the plant every day, every moment of every day, exactly what that plant needs. We are presuming that we know what that plant needs at every moment. And as a scientist, as a researcher, I'm going to tell you that is scientific hubris and arrogance to think we can do that. We can't. We are nowhere near as efficient as nature. We're horribly, horribly inefficient compared to what nature can do.
I thought it was really fascinating for you to use the phrase "just in time" because there's a lot of talk among people when people talk about the supply chains where people are contrasting efficiency with resilience and just in time with just in case. And so there's the discussion going on now is we've put way too much emphasis on efficiency in being just in time. So rather than having a stockpile of things for an emergency, we have supply chains that are designed to at each instant give us what we need for the next day, knowing that the next box is going to come in tomorrow. And that when you have a big disaster like COVID and you have supply chain disruption, suddenly now it's time for just in case, but you don't, now the case is not there. And so it's very fascinating that what you're saying sort of implies that that's kind of a false trade-off in the sense that even being dependent on the global supply chain in a just-in-time case is actually just-in-time is what's supposed to be more efficient than just-in-case because you're only taking what you need as you need it. But you're saying you're wasting half of it. It's not getting efficiently incorporated. So you're actually being very inefficient just by relying at all on the global supply chain. But then you're saying that this just-in-time drip when you rely on the natural ecosystem is coming from an overwhelming permanent abundance of nitrogen in the air. So when you're relying on the natural ecosystem, you don't have a trade-off. You have both. You have a just-in-case endless supply of nitrogen in the air and a just-in-time drip of microorganisms in the soil that are harvesting that in a way that you really couldn't even get rid of them unless you actually tried to do it or just were grossly irresponsible in how you treated the soil. That's fascinating. So that's the end of NPK, right? So now I very much understand why a regenerative farmer is not buying ammonia. But why does a regenerative farmer not need to buy phosphate mined from China or potash that's being sold from Belarus?
Yeah, so outstanding question. And here's why. Because we're not actually deficient in those in our soils. They are bound up because of the lack of microbial activity, population, and balance in that population. They are bound. And also because we're growing monocultures. There are plants that actually interact with microbes in diverse stands of plants. Some of those plants interact with microbes that are phosphate solubilizers. Okay. So there is what is called the standard soil test that farmers and ranchers have been using for the last several decades and heavily relying upon to determine their fertility needs. Now, in very simple terms, the standard soil test tells you about 10% of what you need to know about the soil. And that's it. What it does is it tells you the immediately plant available inorganic forms of N, P, and K. Okay. And that's it. You're not getting anything else in terms of those elements. And so with the standard soil test, it can appear that your soil is deficient in nitrogen, deficient in phosphorus, deficient in potassium, or any other element. But in actuality, they're not. We have done thousands and thousands of what we call TND, total nutrient digestion test of the soil, all over North America. And what we have yet to find any soils anywhere that are truly deficient in phosphorus, in potassium, in manganese, sulfur, zinc, so you name the element. We're not finding deficiencies. So what does that mean? The elements are there, but they're bound. They cannot be released for plant uptake because we have imbalances in the soil and we have significant issues with the soil microbial population. When we introduce regenerative practices, what we find pretty quickly is that as we rebuild and repair that microbial population and the diversity of plant species that are growing out there, then they start to release. And again, on nature's just-in-time basis, they start to solubilize and release the bound phosphorus and all of these other bound elements, so the plants can now take them up. So it would be a false statement to say that our soils are truly deficient in these elements. They are not. And as we go deeper and deeper into that soil profile, we've got more and more and more of those elements available.
That's really interesting, in part because it seems to conflict with a common belief in sort of like alternative nutrition circles, where people think that, you know, we've done so much damage to the soil with intensive farming that the soils are deficient in nutrients, and therefore the crops are deficient in nutrients and the foods are deficient in nutrients. And I guess there's not necessarily a conflict in the sense. Well, I mean, stated that way, there is. You could reconcile them by saying that the damage has been just like losing the soluble forms of those nutrients or something like that. But you're really saying that, at least in the context of North America, there basically are no soils, even that have undergone intensive farming, that have become so damaged that you can't simply treat them to release those minerals. Is there a role, though, for this tilling that you were talking about once a year in conventional, sometimes twice a year in organic? Is that making it more difficult to release the minerals by causing more runoff of the ones that are released?
Well, again, the rule of compounding here, Chris. So it's never just one thing, right? So first of all of our soils across North America and most soils globally are significantly degraded due to our agricultural activity. Now, that does not mean that the elements are gone. They're not. They are there. They are there. And they can once again be accessed through enhanced microbial activity. Okay. So that being said, when we till, now, many conventional farms are tilling multiple times a year, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6. Organic farms, more than that. Okay. You've got organic farms that are tilling, 6, 8, 10, even 12 times a year, depending on the crops that they're growing. So tillage always does significant damage to availability of these elements, these nutrients for plant uptake, because you are destroying, every time you till, you are destroying soil biology, especially mycorrhizal fungi. And the mycorrhizal fungi, think of them as the chief microbe in the soil. Okay. They direct the actions of everything else in the soil. I call them the cog, the linchpin, the catalyst for everything else that happens in the soil. And that is the particular species that we are most devoid in the vast majority of agricultural soils in the US and globally, is mycorrhizal fungi. And when we lack mycorrhizal fungi, we lack the ability of our soils to be able to dissolve or solubilize these bound elements in the soil and make them available for plant uptake. So does the application of synthetics. That impairs mycorrhizal fungi. So does the application of our pesticides, and especially fungicides. What is mycorrhizal fungi? A fungicide. A fungi. We're applying fungicides. Do we think the fungicides that we're applying are target organism specific? Well, of course they're not. There's no chemical we apply that impacts only the target organism. No insecticide, no herbicide, anything. They impact a whole host of other organisms. So when we kill what we think are harmful fungi that cause fungal disease in plants, we're also significantly damaging the mycorrhizal fungi that we so desperately need in our soils. So that's really the key here. If we can implement practices that repair and rebuild the mycorrhizal fungi population and their function, that's when we don't have these deficiencies in the soils anymore. And that's when our foods are much more nutrient dense. And we are proving that through this phytonutrient research that we're collaborating in with Dr. Stefan Van Vliet and his team of researchers.
What are a couple of typical things that you would do if, let's say a conventional farmer hired you and said, I've tilled the ever living daylights out of my soil for the last 18 years, but I want some mycorrhizal fungi. What would be the top 3 things that you would be doing to get those fungi in there?
So the first is stop the tillage, switch to no-till, right? Instead of tillage. So that's the very first thing that we're going to talk to them about, is helping them transition from tillage to no-till. And we have excellent no-till drills today that can be used in farming situations. And we've got more and more farmers adopting that no-till technology now. The second thing is increase their crop species, their cash crop diversity. If we look at most farmers in America, particularly in the Midwest, what are they growing? Corn and soybeans, corn and soybeans, corn and soybeans, ad nauseum, year after year, right? It's no longer a rotation. That's not diversity. Corn rotated with soybeans is not diversity. So we're doing nothing to build mycorrhizal populations with that. So we've got to add in more different types of cash crops in their rotation. The third thing is incorporate in between your cash crops highly diverse cover crop mixes with plant species in those cover crop mixes that are known mycorrhizal associators, that are known to help build mycorrhizal populations in the soil. Some examples of those: cereal rye, oats, barley, okay, are perfect examples of cover crops that help to build mycorrhizal populations in the soil. And there's many others that we could talk about. But so those are the top 3 things that we would do immediately. And then the fourth is, whenever possible, add livestock into that equation to graze those cover crops. Because when you add the livestock on top of that, the livestock themselves do a lot to stimulate the mycorrhizal population. And the other thing that the livestock will do through their manure is they will spread mycorrhizal spores. So they actually help to spread and grow mycorrhizal populations faster and more effectively.
Awesome. All right. So in this kind of builds a model where where I've been doing several interviews covering the rising cost of food and the prospects that things are going to get potentially a lot worse this year, especially outside of the U.S. in more food insecure populations. And so some of the big things that come up is uh, partly due to shipping and stuff like that, but a big driver is the cost of fuel is increasing. And so when the cost of fuel increases, not only do you have fuel use in the equipment on the farm and in the transport of food, but you also have enormous amounts of fuel that are used in the mining of minerals that are used in fertilizers. And so you basically have this cascade from the rising cost of energy that's leading into fertilizer shortages. And you can put geopolitical things on top of that and whatever, but we've had rising costs of energy for a long time, and that's now manifesting in this cascading this cascading cycle where now the question is, where are you going to get your ammonia? Where are you going to get your potash? Where are you going to get your phosphate? And then you now have conventional farms that, if those things are running low, are going to bid up the manure that the organic farms would have used, and so on. And so here you are basically saying, we have this enormous supply of NPK that is right here in the soil and in the air, and we just need to we just need to nourish this natural, just-in-time provision of solubilizing the minerals in the soil and fixing nitrogen in the air, and we cut out those inputs. Now, and that's fascinating by itself. I imagine there must be fossil fuel inputs on a typical regenerative farm. You're not only transporting the food, unless you have everyone coming to you burning their own fossil fuels to get to your farm store. But I assume you use less if you are focusing on less mechanical treatments of the soil. But can you run us through, like, the typical regenerative farmer must have a tractor? I don't, what I think of is sort of irrigation systems, tractors, drying systems for farmers that are producing a lot of grains and things like that. What is just like the fuel input in a typical regenerative farm? And could you also give, I'm not sure if this is within your expertise, but if you can you give us some sense of, like, in a typical shopping bag of food in the grocery store versus a similar mix of foods I might buy from a regenerative farm, what percentage of the costs in that are coming from, like, transporting versus these synthetic inputs versus running the tractor? Can you give us a sense of, like, what are the fossil fuel inputs and how important are they in the price of that food?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess first let's start with how do regenerative farms typically differ from more conventional farms. And let's start with spring field preparation and planting as an example. So with that, a conventional farmer will make somewhere usually between 3 and 5 passes in that field in preparation and planting. Okay, so getting the field ready. A lot of times they'll do an initial burn down pass. So that means they're either hiring a crop duster, to fly on herbicide. And obviously that's very intensive fossil fuel use right there to get a plane or a helicopter in the air, to apply these herbicides to burn down these fields every spring. Or they're running what may be called a high boy over it, the big spray rigs that go over it. So you've got that. Then they're going to start their field preparation. So their field cultivation. And they're going to do 2, maybe 3 passes for field cultivation and preparation. Then they're going to make the final pass for planting. So now you finally got the seed in the ground on a conventional farm. So 3 to 5 passes of equipment, fossil fuel use, labor, depreciation, everything else being utilized to accomplish that, right? On a regenerative farm, we can often do every bit of that in a single pass, one. So we have quite a few of our farmers now that are going in and they're doing what we call planting green. So they're rolling down the cover crop and planting with a no-till drill right into that rolled down cover crop in the same pass. So we have significantly reduced the number of passes in that field every year versus conventional or organic farmer. An organic farmer is actually going to make more field passes than a conventional farmer to get those fields ready to plant on average. So the organic farm makes the most passes, the conventional farm, the intermediate, the regenerative farm, the fewer. The other thing is that we need less equipment on a regenerative farm. And as a matter of fact, that's one of the things that we often identify with farmers that are making the transition from conventional to regenerative, is we help them identify all the equipment that they now no longer need to farm regeneratively. That can be sold and those dollars utilized to help with, implementing additional regenerative practices. So that's a pretty quick example, of what happens here and how we can significantly reduce all of these passes and fossil fuel usage in a regenerative operation versus another. Now, what we're also trying to build here within the regenerative communities is more local and regional based food production and distribution, right? And COVID certainly brought that to light. We have so heavily aggregated our food system into the hands of so few companies that if any hiccup occurs in there, as you said it, they're just in time delivery. And that most certainly happened during COVID. And guess what? It's getting ready to happen again. We're getting ready to experience this once more in 2022, not due to COVID, but due to a multiplicity of other reasons. They have a lot of hiccups in that supply line. The average food product moves between 1,500 and 2,000 miles before it finally gets on a consumer's plate. With regenerative agriculture, we are building out the farming, the processing, the aggregation, the distribution in local and regional situations so that now all of those resources, all of those dollars stay within those communities and turn over and over in those communities like they're supposed to, rather than leaving the community like they do with conventional agriculture. And we are able to have far better delivery of food in case there's any type of situation that occurs, because now food has to travel far fewer miles to get to the consumer.
Do you have any sense of or any data on in a typical grocery bill at the store, what percentage of that price are you paying for this massive transport? Do you have any sense of that?
That's a very good question. It's going to be fairly significant. And, if I were to throw a percent out there, I'd probably be lying to you. So I'm not going to do that. Yeah. But, however, there is one thing that people need to understand. And that is that what we think is cheap food is not cheap food. The conventional farmers and ranchers are very, very heavily subsidized. And so in the farm bill every year, we as taxpayers are paying in billions upon billions of dollars in taxes to support the farm bill. So that's a food dollar as well. We're just not counting it as a food dollar, right? So we're fooling ourselves. We think we're buying cheap food, and we are not buying cheap food at all. We're buying very expensive food, but it's just the price on the actual food package doesn't appear to be expensive because we have forgotten to include all of the tax dollars that we paid in that contributed to the subsidy that those farmers were paid to produce that food.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of controversy over what type of inflation we're going to see later this year, but we might wind up paying some back taxes on those subsidies that we've been deferring for a long time later this year. All right, so we're cutting out this transport, and that's kind of it's bigger than just what's going on in the farm, but just in terms of viewing this as a sort of building a local community around the local regenerative farm. In that model, we're cutting out this transport cost, which is a big part of the fuel cost. If you are you able to give some? I know you have experience in different contexts. What is your sense of the general difference in like how much like fuel cost is being burned in this? You gave the example of like 5 passes versus 1, et cetera. Do you have a general sense of just like what is it? Is it a two times fuel difference or a 5 times fuel difference? Do you have a sense of that?
It's a 3 to 5 times. It's a 3 to 5 times fuel difference minimum just on the farm alone.
Right.
Okay, just on the farm alone, and that doesn't count, all the fuel usage once you get off the farm. And these products, these commodities that are produced, then have to be shipped, to these, aggregated, consolidated processors, and then processing when you get to the large scale processors, it's highly fragmented there. So one type of processing on a food product is done at one plant, and then it's shipped to another plant for another type of processing, and then another plant for another type of processing. So now you've got the same foodstuffs being shipped multiple times to different processing plants before it's then put on a truck and shipped to distribution centers, right, for your major food distributors like Cisco and so forth. So now it goes to their DCs, just like Amazon and Walmart has their DCs, right? And so you have all these distribution centers that everything is shipped to and aggregated. Then it's put on yet another truck and shipped out to the communities and the stores and that type of thing. So when you start adding up all of those multipliers, then it very quickly gets way beyond just that 3 to 5 times differential that you see on the farm.
So a couple little side questions. So in your experience, personally or consulting with farmers, a couple of things that have come up besides the major ones that we've been talking about that have been highlighted as possible contributors to increasing food prices or a coming food crisis when talking to large conventional producers in the Midwest is that the chip shortage is making it very difficult to get equipment repairs. So there was one story of a farmer who had to go like many states out to get a tractor repaired because the parts weren't there in his local area. And then another one is that there's a combination of decreased international labor due to vaccine mandates at border crossings, and then the fact that Americans who generally don't want to work on farms anyway are also in their own labor shortage due to the Great Resignation. Is the typical regenerative farmer exposed to these types of stresses as well, in terms of equipment and labor?
Yeah, to a certain extent, but it certainly is lessened. Okay. Years ago, we made this big move towards what is called precision agriculture. And precision agriculture was supposed to create all of these efficiencies we were supposed to be able to significantly reduce the use of synthetics and all forms of pesticides. And it was to make labor shortages and those types of things, almost negated. And we were never supposed to have this problem with equipment breakdowns and not being able to repair equipment in time. Well, the problem is that we have made equipment just like our vehicles that everybody drives around now, essentially a computer.
Yeah.
And so farmers and ranchers can no longer repair if they have this most modern equipment. They can't do their own repairs anymore. And for, a long time, farmers and ranchers did the majority of their own mechanic work. They did their own repairs. Machinery was simply manufactured, simply made, and fairly easy to repair. Even growing up as a kid, I used to help my father and grandfather repair our tractors and so forth. You could do it right there in the field. So today you've got to get a computer diagnostician out, and they've got to run diagnostics on it. And then, yes, you've got to wait on some chip or other computer part or motherboard or whatever to be shipped in to be able to actually get rolling in the field again. So a number of our regenerative farmers, to be honest with you, have actually gone back to older equipment that they can actually get parts for and they can repair. So they've actually gone completely away from precision agriculture and GIS guided equipment and these types of things, to be able to avoid those types of issues. So that is certainly a help. And the other thing that's happening is that, because we don't use our equipment as much, we don't have as much wear and tear. And the other issue is that many of these conventional farmers are now trying, because their profit margins are so incredibly narrow on a per acre basis, they're trying to farm way too many acres. A single farmer is trying to cover far, far too many acres. And that means they're going to have more equipment, more labor. They're going to have more breakdowns, more issues in that regard. And their windows for field work, field activity are much narrower because of that and the fact that their soils are too degraded. We have just the opposite in regenerative agriculture. We have much broader field windows within which to get our work done, to plant, to harvest, all of that, because we are building our soils rather than degrading them. We don't have to farm near as many acres per farmer to make the same amount of net profit as a conventional farmer does. So instead of being so spread thin on way too many acres, we can focus our efforts on far fewer acres as individual farmers and do a far better job at what we're doing. We don't need, we don't need as much labor often as these massive farmers. But the other thing that happens, though, is that we're actually creating some really good jobs. And we have a lot of people now that are seeking out jobs on regenerative farms because it's so much more pleasant and fulfilling than jobs on most conventional farms. So, and we pay them better. Like the people that work for us on our own farms, there is no other farm they could go to anywhere in our region as a conventional farm and make anywhere close to what they can make on our farm. So they have a much better job, a higher paying job, a more fulfilling job, and they can also make more money than they can go into any of the local factories or anything like that. So we're actually revitalizing rural economies and bringing better paying jobs to the communities versus conventional agriculture can muster.
It seems to me like I'm sure that someone who would buy like the same amount and the same type of food at a grocery store is paying less than they would from a regenerative farm. And it seems like what's happening is you're removing a lot of like low skill labor and a lot of fossil fuel and fertilizer inputs, and you're replacing those with more emphasis on technical skill, technical expertise, and high skill labor. So, as you were just saying, you have more farmers per acre of land because each farmer has a smaller piece of land. So you basically have more farmers. So, like the chief technical expert, there's more of those. And then you have more fulfilling and more interesting jobs, which I assume are more fulfilling and interesting because, in part, the people feel like they're actually they're actually learning something and engaging their technical skill, as well as feeling like it's the right thing to do to treat the soil that way. And so the customer is generally going to be paying more because you're getting a customer who wants a higher quality product and who would rather be putting those dollars into that technical expertise. But what I'm, and as you mentioned before, you're also not, you're all, you don't, you also aren't dealing with this market distortion of massive subsidies going into conventional farming. But in what's moving forward, um, it seems like that's the way it's been with that cost differential now, is could change a lot in the sense that if there is a global shortage of phosphate or something like that, then and that price can go up 5x or 10x if that gets really tight. Um, or even there's other things like besides the supply chains. One of the things that I talked about with an economist is that with the 42% increase in the money supply and the liquidity injection that went into the stock market, a lot of that money now is moving out of tech stocks and is going into buying commodities. And as it looks like the tech bubble is crashing, possibly in a big way once again, as it did decades ago, a lot of the huge financial institutions are going to want to protect themselves by buying commodities, and if they do, then a lot of the passive indexing funds that just chase momentum might start chasing after it. So you can have the price of a fertilizer spike just because no one can get their hands on it, but then because it's traded by financial institutions, you have like these giant financial institutions saying we need to have part of our portfolio as fertilizer. And so all this liquidity that found its way into the market now is amplifying all those prices. And so suddenly, if you were paying $7 for the amazing regenerative eggs instead of $2 for the cheapest eggs that you can find in the grocery store, if the price of the fertilizer input to the conventional farm goes up 10x, you're not going to have a 10x increase in the cost of the farmer's technical expertise. And so I'm imagining that, apart from creating resilience within our communities and doing the right thing for the soil, this also seems to offer protection against what is the potential for severe rises in price if those cost inputs go out of control. Although, there's also the fact that if there's general inflation and everyone's cost for everything is going up, obviously the price of even the regenerative agriculture has got to go up because if people are paying more for their mortgage, or they're paying more for their own food, or they're paying more for their car, or they're paying more for everything else, they got to get paid, right? So, what is your sense of? I mean, and I'm just like throwing out totally random numbers, but I'm imagining that, like in this world, you could see the $2 eggs go to $6 and the $7 eggs go to $9, and so there's still, the stuff the grocery store is probably still the cheaper product, but now all of a sudden, the differential is much smaller, and a lot of people, it will make a lot more sense for them to put a little better investment in getting something better. Am I on the right track in thinking about it? How do you see it?
Well, that's already happening. I mean, if you look at the number of consumers now that are voting with their food dollar, consciously buying, the pasture-raised eggs versus the commodity eggs, consciously buying the grass-fed hamburger versus the commodity hamburger, so on and so forth. So we're already seeing this happen, and there's a rapidly growing portion of the consumer population that is now realizing that food is also their medicine. And COVID has certainly helped to fuel that. So you pay a heavy price, not just in your tax dollars, to subsidize those $2 eggs. So the $2 eggs are not $2 eggs. They're only $2 at the grocery store. But you actually paid more than double that in your tax dollars to get those $2 eggs. But that aside, if I'm eating $2 eggs versus eggs from hens that are on pasture, I've got a significant health difference, a very big health difference. And that's what our phytonutrient research is showing, that we're doing with Dr. Van Vliet and his team, is that, an egg is not an egg, milk is not milk, a tomato is not a tomato. We are finding, as a matter of fact, so far we have found as much as an 87% difference in nutrient density in the same foods. Just the difference in those same foods being the soils that they were grown or raised in and how they were produced. Okay. So what price do you put on your health? And what does it cost? What do pharmaceuticals cost? What do medical procedures cost? What a hospital and other medical care cost amount to? If we can avoid a lot of those, then what we view as more expensive food is not more expensive at all. It's actually the cheapest thing that we can do when we add up all of the other associated costs that go along with foods that frankly are not very healthy for us.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that, that's, you can think of it in dollars, you can think of it in time. If you don't spend, someone besides me, I don't know who the quote is originally goes to, but if you don't make time for your health, you're going to be forced to make time for your illness. It's the same thing. If you don't spend $1 on your health, you're going to be forced to spend a few dollars on your illness. So when people are thinking like, all right, what do we do about this? If there are people who are listening that want to start buying regenerative agriculture, both in the sense of improving their health, but also making our communities more resilient in the face of what seems to be possibly an imminent food availability or food price problem later this year. One of the things that comes to mind is, what is the length of time that a farmer needs to increase their production of something if there's an influx of people buying their products? Because right now we're halfway through April. If someone goes and purchases CSA shares or does something to try to support regenerative farmers now, is that enough time for them to make more food for those people, especially if there's like a 30% rise in interest that's coming in now? Like, what's the time scale that a farmer needs to say, oh, people want to buy more of my stuff, I better have an extra cow or something like that?
Yeah, and so it depends on the type of food, obviously, right? What kind of food product you're talking about, but just a handful of examples. And first, I'll say that, now we're in April, mid-April. Now is the time. If that's what you're wanting to do, make that move now, because, this is planting season. So farmers are planting now and making those planting plans. So what we put in the ground now is being determined right now. So we need to hear from you if we've got more demand that's coming down the pike. And that's important, not just for the plant crops, the plant-based foods that you may be interested in, but, if I'm planting to feed livestock, then I need to know that as well. So now is the time for them to act on that. But then secondly, so let's say it's vegetable crops, from the time I plant to the time I harvest, for most crops, 120 days, 90 to 150 days would cover almost every plant crop that we can think of, from the time we plant to the time we harvest, unless it's more of a perennial crop. So if I have that amount of time, so 4 months, 5 months lead time, right? Then we can do that for you. If it's eggs, then it takes 16 to 20 weeks from the time you hatch a chick to the time that those hens are now laying eggs, producing eggs. If it's broilers, for regenerative broilers, we're talking about 8 to 10 weeks from the time they're hatched to the time they're ready to harvest. If you're wanting pastured pork, from the time a pig is born to the time we harvest it, 10 months to a year on average. So that's the kind of lead time that we typically need, to be able to help people. And let me say one more thing real quick, sort of clarify this cost difference in food right now. So with regenerative farmers, it's not the cost of production on the farm that is more expensive than conventional. It's not. Okay. Where our costs come in is off the farm, in the processing of those products, and the packaging and the marketing and the cold storage and the distribution, right? That's where we have more cost as a regenerative farmer in that than we do in actually raising or growing the product itself. So let me give you a perfect example. Let's use beef as an example here. So I can raise a beef animal all the way to the point of harvest actually cheaper than a feedlot can, okay? But that feedlot is then going to sell to a big packer, Tyson or JBS or Cargill or somebody like that. And their costs, because they have consolidated massive processing plants, their cost to slaughter and fabricate that animal into the end products is 1/10 of my cost, because I'm using much smaller plants that right now we don't have enough of. So where they're paying $100, I'm paying $1,000. Okay. So that's where some of this major difference comes in. Their cost to transport are cheaper because they're transporting in much larger volumes than I can. Their cost of cold storage is significantly cheaper because they can build out massive cold storage units that cost them pennies on the dollar. Mine cost a lot more pennies on the dollar. Same thing with packaging, everything else. So that's where our higher costs come in, is not in what it costs us to raise and produce that product, but what it costs us to do everything else to that product to actually get it to you, the consumer, after that point. Now, how do we resolve that? We're working on that, and that is building out additional processing capacity in our local and regional communities. That's what we have to have so that we can become much more comparable in those post-farm costs to conventional agriculture. And remember, the conventional farmer never sells the consumer their product. The conventional farmer, you never buy from the conventional farmer. You don't buy any of that. You buy your beef, your chicken, your eggs, your grains, whatever, from the grocery store or from the restaurant, right? Never from the conventional farmer. So there's a whole sea of differences between us here.
Is resolving that processing capacity and storage capacity, is that something that will primarily be driven by increased demand from consumers so that there's more capital investment, or is that something that also has regulatory constraints that are in the way? Is it just a matter of having the capital, or is it? Yeah.
Yes, it is. It is, because these plants actually, in terms of communities and being able to actually build these out, they're much smaller plants than the massive plants. So communities often don't have near the objection to them that they would to a massive processing plant. They're much smaller footprint and frankly far better run, on average. And so it is basically the need for the capital. And right now, post-COVID, we have seen an influx of capital infusion into this. So we have seen a build out, and it's still continuing, of additional processing capacity. We need more than what we have, but at least we have started to rectify that problem.
Is that infusion of capital coming from more people buying regenerative products, or is it coming from somewhere else?
Well, it's coming from investors predominantly,
oh, really?
But those investors are stimulated to make that investment directly because of more people buying these products.
Right. There's got to be some people that are, if they're coming from a different mindset, they're looking at this and they're saying, well, this all seems nice, but this shortage of fertilizer is what's fueling like the ability to feed these billions of people. What would you say to that? Do you have data on like the yield per acre or anything that can, like, is there data that can back up whether? I know you said that we've produced way more biomass in the past than we do now, but what do the data say in terms of just being able to shift in this direction to really like feed a global planet?
Yeah, we get asked that question all the time, Chris. Yeah, I mean, almost every day. Okay. So it's a very, very common question. Well, and the statement's always made, well, you can't feed the world that way, guys. So why are you bothering? Well, I would also then have to say, well, you certainly can't feed the world with certified organic. Why are we bothering? Right? So I'm gonna go on just a brief tangent and then get back to that. So if we look at, for instance, in the U.S., total agronomic acres, the total number of acres after a few decades of certified organic being in existence, out of all agronomic acres in the U.S. is still only 0.67%. That's it. Okay, just 0.67% of all agronomic acres in the U.S. are certified organic. But here's the deal with regenerative. In conventional agriculture, if you grow corn on an acre of soil, what else do you have that year? Anything?
Nothing.
No, just corn. Okay. So a conventional farmer raises one crop on a single acre in a single year, and that's it, right? They have a single revenue stream per acre, nothing more. Regenerative agriculture is not like that at all. So if I'm a conventional corn and soybean farmer, I'm going to plant some of my acres every year in corn and some of my acres every year in soybeans. And my corn acres are only going to yield corn, and I'm only going to have that single crop and that single crop to sell, right? And my soybean acres the same way. I've only got soybeans. That's all I've produced on that acre that entire year. That's all I have to sell. And then those acres are laying vacant or dormant the entire rest of the year. Now, how long does it take a corn or soybean crop to grow from planting to harvest? An average of 120 to 130 days, okay? So that means 2/3 of the year, nothing is going on that acre to generate food or revenue for the farmer, right? Well, with regenerative farming, I've got 2/3 of the year on the same acre that I just grew that cash crop on to now grow a multiplicity of other things. Let me give you an example. All right. So I grew a corn crop. I then planted a cover crop. Now I can either harvest that cover crop as additional grains. So I can plant a diverse cover crop mix and then harvest that and harvest multiple grains. So instead of just corn to sell, I've got 3, 4, 5 different grains that I'm producing on the same acre for sale that year. Or I can put livestock on that cover crop in between my cash crops and graze that cover crop, produce gain and performance on my livestock. Now I'm producing additional foodstuffs off of those same acres that I just grew that corn on in the same year. Okay. And I'm producing additional revenue as a farmer off that same acre. Now, if I'm going to graze that crop, that cover crop, I can do multi-species. So I can put cattle on there, sheep on there, pastured pigs on there, and chickens on there. So I could actually now have 4 more foods being grown, proteins, in addition to the corn in my off season, and produce revenue from them. Then, because I've got a diverse cover crop and many of those are flowering species, I can add honeybees to the equation and I can produce honey. Now I've got a 6th food crop that I'm growing on the same acre in the same year, and a 6th revenue stream on the same acre in the same year. So the argument that it's going to take a lot more acres to produce the same amount of food using regenerative agriculture is an absolute total myth, and it's a moot point. We can produce far more food per acre every year doing this regeneratively than a conventional farmer can even dream of touching.
Awesome answer. All right, so last couple of questions, one on society and then one on the individual consumer. So when we're talking about the food crisis and the food prices rising, most discussions that are centering on conventional farming are looking largely at societal responses to try to solve the problem, because we have questions around the regulation of oil drilling, or the financial wars and commodity wars and that are happening in geopolitical context, or all these different policy responses. And here we're talking about something that is much more centered around a resilient small community, where all these things are kind of flying around in the environment and aren't really crossing ways. Do you see important societal responses to be able to support regenerative agriculture despite that?
We do, and we're experiencing those every day. We are having literally daily conversations with people around the globe who are keenly interested in implementing regenerative agriculture in their countries. And a lot of this is coming from the leaders of those countries. So the leaders of a number of countries now are seeing and understanding this is the path they need to take, and this is what they want to try to influence within their own farming community and food community in their countries. So there's something almost magical about this, to be honest with you, when you talk to people. This is not a divider. This is a forging of a global community. When you talk about regenerative agriculture, this is something that we have found we all have common ground in. We can all agree on. Unfortunately, and as I said at the beginning, I grew up as a farmer and rancher, so I've been in agriculture my entire life. And what I see today in conventional agriculture, particularly row crop production, is very disconcerting, because their profit margins are so narrow, and they're forced to try to farm as many acres as they can to be able to make a living. They are heavily competing against each other for the same acres. The vast majority of row crop farmers today do not own most of the acres they farm. They're leasing it. And so they are at times almost at war against each other in their local communities, bidding on land to lease, to farm. So it's creating enmity. Conventional agriculture today is creating enmity and division regenerative agriculture is doing the exact opposite. And as a matter of fact, many of the conventional farmers that we work with that have transitioned to regenerative agriculture have noted that very thing. Where before they got into regenerative, they were secretive, they were competitive, they didn't want their neighboring farmers to know what they were doing, right? They didn't share. Today, those exact same farmers, and this is what I love about it, okay? Those exact same farmers are sharing with the world what they're doing. They can't wait to share with people, and they'll go talk to their conventional neighbors and say, hey, you need to do this too. And it almost scares their conventional neighbors, right? Because they're like, whoa, wait a minute. You didn't want to talk to me 3 years ago, and now you're telling me you want to share with me. You want me to actually come on your farm and see what you're doing? Are you kidding me? So they turn into regenerative prophets, and that's what's so amazing. The community that is established, the network that is established here, is absolutely astounding, and it supersedes geopolitical boundaries.
So to get that positive societal response, is this primarily education that's going on, or do you have like a legislative agenda or anything like that?
I cringed when you said legislative, and I did that purposefully. Honestly, we are not going to get this done that way. Okay. And to me, that is a waste of our time to approach it in that manner. We're going to change this from the grassroots. In the US, farmers make up less than 1% of the total population today. So, it's the other 99% that holds all the power. The consumer, even over politicians and politics, the consumer still holds the power ultimately. So if this is what the consumer wants, well, guess what? Soon enough, the politicians will want it as well, or they won't get reelected. So, and they know that. This supersedes lobbying dollars, everything else. Getting reelected is more important than lobbying dollars, right? So yes, this is very much an educational and awareness effort, and it's all about creating more awareness among the broader population.
Given the power of the consumer, this is my final question for you. So, the consumer who's listening to this and heard you say that middle of April, the time is now to take action. First of all, how does the consumer even find a regenerative farm near them to support? And then what are the best specific actions that consumers can take to support that farmer, and to support that farmer particularly in a way where if they're saying, I really want to move resources in the direction of regenerative farming this year in a way that will have an impact, what are the specific things that consumers should be doing right now?
Yeah, so several things. And first of all, this is why we created Regenified, to be able to validate and verify foods that are produced regeneratively, so that the consumer can have that high level of assurance and confidence that what they're buying is the real deal. It's not a facade. So that's one of the reasons we created Regenified. The other reason was to be able to allow food companies to have a path to be able to source regeneratively verified foods and to be able to get those out to their consumer population. And the third was to be able to provide that access to the consumer, that list of regenerative farms in their locales, so that they would know where to go. So those are the three principal reasons that we created Regenified, to accomplish just that. But what we encourage is, first of all, as a consumer, when you go to a restaurant, tell them that you want regeneratively sourced foods served at those restaurants. when you go to a grocery store, tell the manager, I would like to see regeneratively sourced foods in your store. And believe it or not, it doesn't take very many people at all asking for something before the restaurants, the food distribution companies, and the stores respond. For instance, a typical grocery store, if just 8 to 10 people, think about how many people shop at a typical grocery store a week. But in a week's time, if they hear from just 8 to 10 people, I want this, they're going to go get that, because they know that if 8 to 10 are asking, there's hundreds and hundreds that also want that product that aren't asking. So it doesn't take a lot asking your restaurants and your grocery stores for these products before they act. And then they're going to seek out people like us, to be able to source these foodstuffs from. So again, the consumer holds all the power. Your purchase power, your food dollar matters. Purchase regenerative foods, and it will make a difference. Ask for regenerative foods, and it will make a difference. And then look for regenerative foods through platforms like Understanding Ag and Regenified.
Awesome. All right. So where can people find Regenified and Understanding Ag, and is there anywhere else that people should follow your work?
Absolutely. So, for Understanding Ag, it's understandingag.com. Okay, so ag is AG, understandingag.com. Regenified is regenified.com. And then they can also, if they're interested in educational opportunities beyond that, they can go to our soilhealthacademy.org. And we have online courses. We've got reams of material. We've got articles and webinars and podcasts and online courses and on and on. So we've got a lot of resources available for people to learn and to have access to. I would also recommend one of our partners, and a lot of what we do is the Ecdysis Foundation. And that's ECDYSIS, and go to ecdysis.org. And that's Dr. Jonathan Lundgren and his team of researchers. And they have done a lot of the seminal work in looking at the benefits of regenerative agriculture. So another really good resource, if you're interested in the research behind a lot of this, would be from ecdysis.com. Or .org, ecdysis.org.
Alan Williams, this was a great discussion. Fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been an honor.